Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
I was called a genius because I was the first person to figure out how to program those 64 binary thousand tightly coupled tiny computers that shared nothing. What made the news headlines was that I figured out how to harness the potential or untapped supercomputer power of my 65,536 computers, tiny computers. I visualized those slow computers as encircling my internet and doing so in a manner that was metaphorically akin to my flying 65,536 grand challenge codes and to my flying those computer codes through as many tiny computers and to my flying them while I was blindfolded. My wizardry resided in the technological achievement that I did not need to see any of the 65,536 tiny computers that I used to invent the world's fastest supercomputer. I physicalized the world's fastest supercomputer, and I did so without using my biological eyes to see any of its processors, and I did so without using my fingers to touch any of its processors. Because I was programming a record number of processors and doing so blindfolded, I had to have some concrete metaphors that I associated to that never before programmed supercomputer hopeful that was a new internet de facto. I drew my metaphors from my life experiences. Back in the 1980s, I quote unquote mapped about my 32 closest blood relatives from the same house in my ancestral hometown of Onitsha, Nigeria, to the same house in my adopted hometown of Washington, District of Columbia, United States. If I had mapped each of my 32 relatives to 32 different states, they will not have the nearest neighboring communication that they needed to do well in the United States. That nearest neighbor metaphor inspired me to do the same with my ensemble of processors that was a group of 65,536 tightly coupled processors that were identical and that shared nothing, and that I viewed as one seamless, cohesive supercomputer. What made the news headlines was that on the 4th of July 1989, I discovered how that ensemble becomes the world's fastest supercomputer. I discovered how the fastest computer can be manufactured from the slowest computers called processors. I discovered how to map 32 real-world problems to 32 processors that were tightly coupled and that shared nothing. The general idea was to imagine Onitsha as comprised of 65,536 households and to move all 2 raised to power 16 households in Onitsha, Nigeria, into as many houses in Washington, District of Columbia, United States. I was in the news because I discovered how to move them in a proximity preserving way that preserves the original nearest neighboring structure. Namely, if Okonkwo and Okafor were nearest neighbors in Onitsha, then my nearest neighboring mapping would also preserve them as nearest neighbors in Washington, District of Columbia, United States. The word computer was first used in print 2,000 years ago. It was first used by the Roman author Pliny the Elder. The computer as we understand it today is the programmable supercomputer that was invented in 1946. In 1996, I was invited as an honoree to a celebration called the 50th anniversary of the modern computer. That celebration took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. At that 50th anniversary banquet, a guest asked me, "Why were you honored for the development of the computer that was invented before you were born?" I answered, "My contribution to the development of the computer was that on the 4th of July 1989, I discovered the massively parallel supercomputer that is faster than the vector processing supercomputer. That is, I discovered the modern supercomputer of today that will become the modern computer of tomorrow."
Insightful and brilliant lecture.